A Chinese satellite pulled up alongside a dead one, grabbed it and towed it 3,000 kilometers off into the dark. No announcement. That was January 2022, and the thing it grabbed had been drifting, useless, for over a decade. But the arm China used to drag a corpse across the sky is the same kind of arm that can grab a satellite that still works and move it anywhere it wants. Which leaves one question hanging over the whole orbit. If China can quietly do that to anything up there, who is actually allowed to check what it's doing? Because there's a bigger story sitting under this one. China owns that entire ability on its own. It built the machine and the whole program behind it, with no American ever allowed in the room. And that total independence traces back to a wall the United States put up, something most people have never connected to any of this. So let's start with the satellite itself, because there are two very different things going on with this one spacecraft, the story China tells about it and what it can actually do. The spacecraft is called Shenzhou-21. It launched in October 2021, and China's own state contractor described its job in the gentlest possible terms. It was there, they said, to help deal with space debris. Clean up the junk, a cosmic street sweeper. Nobody argued with that, because it's true. That is one thing the machine can do. Then in January 2022, tracking firms watching that orbit saw it do the thing. Shenzhou-21 closed in on a defunct Chinese navigation satellite, a Beidou craft that had died in orbit years earlier and been drifting as dead weight ever since. It docked with it, and on the 22nd it fired a long burn and dragged the dead satellite up and out, about 3,000 kilometers above the crowded band where the valuable satellites live. For comparison, the normal parking spot for a dead satellite is a few hundred kilometers up. This was thousands. Then it let go and came back down to work. And pulling off a docking and a controlled tow that far out is one of the hardest things anyone can do in that orbit. So in near silence, China had just shown it could reach a specific satellite in the most valuable band of orbit we have, and move it wherever it liked. Cleaning up one dead satellite by towing it 10 times farther than you need to is a strange way to sweep a street. But set the motive aside, because motive is the one thing we can't read from orbit. Look at the move on its own. Find a specific object in space, sneak up on it, grab hold of it, and relocate it against its will. That is the capability. And a working satellite would be no harder to grab than a dead one, and it matters enormously which orbit we are talking about. This is geostationary orbit, 36,000 kilometers up, where a satellite hangs over one fixed spot on Earth and stays there. It's the most expensive neighborhood in space. Military communications, missile warning satellites, the relays that banks and broadcasters and governments run their traffic through, they're all parked up there, most of them with no shielding and no real way to dodge. A spacecraft that can quietly close in and take hold of one of those is not something anyone in that orbit can afford to ignore. And this is where it stops being my read and becomes an official one, because a 4-star general said it out loud before the tow even happened. In April 2021, General James Dickinson, the head of US Space Command, sat in front of Congress. This is months before Shenzhou-21 grabbed anything. He was asked about Chinese satellites like this one, and he told the committee they could be used, in his words, for grappling other satellites. In the same stretch of testimony, he warned that China was chasing what he called space superiority through space and space attack systems. Blunt language from the one officer whose actual job was watching this. And he put it on the record while the spacecraft was still just sitting there, looking harmless. So think about the order of events here. A US commander flagged this exact ability, and less than a year later it showed up in orbit doing exactly that. That's not a hypothetical anymore. It happened on a specific date to a real satellite. Now, a careful analyst will tell you to slow down here, and they're right to. Todd Harrison, at the think tank CSIS, looked at the same tow and said it raises more questions than answers about what China actually intends. And that's the honest position. We can track exactly what these satellites do, but their intent stays invisible to us and to everyone outside Beijing. But that gap is the whole story of this video, and it traces straight back to a single decision the United States made in 2011. So where did that decision come from? It starts with a law almost nobody outside the space world has heard of, the thing that put China on the outside in the first place. In 2011, a congressman named Frank Wolf slipped a short passage into a spending bill. It became Public Law 112-10, and the relevant piece is Section 1340. The language is dry, and that's exactly why it's worth hearing. It bars NASA from using any of its funding to, quote, participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company unless Congress specifically signs off. In any way. Read that again slowly. That covers any cooperation at all of any kind, not only the obvious military stuff. Wolf was a long-standing critic of Beijing, and he wanted the ban airtight. And this wasn't a one-year mood. Congress has renewed it every single year since, written into the spending bill again for 2026. 15 years, no gap. It's so absolute that when NASA merely wanted to let American scientists study the moon rocks China brought back, it had to work around this same clause first. For NASA, cooperating with China is simply against the law. The stated reason was security. China's space program is tied to its military, so the worry was that cooperation would hand over sensitive technology and know-how. Reasonable enough, but the wall didn't work the way it was supposed to. The ban backfired. It pushed China to build the whole thing itself, the one outcome it was supposed to prevent. The most concrete effect of the Wolf Amendment was the International Space Station. The ISS is the great shared laboratory, dozens of nations, decades of joint engineering, a place where you learn how to dock spacecraft and operate robotic arms alongside everyone else, in the open, where everyone can see everyone else's hardware. China got shut out of it completely, barred from the whole project. A country in that position has two options: give up on crewed spaceflight or build the whole thing itself. China chose to build. It couldn't buy a seat on someone else's station, so it made its own. The core module, Tianhe, went up in 2021. Two lab modules, Wentian and Mengtian, joined it in 2022. That's the Tiangong station, complete and crewed, orbiting right now. And to build a station alone, you have to build every skill a station needs, alone. Docking, rendezvous, robotic arms that reach out and handle objects in orbit. On the ISS, that knowledge is shared and watched by everyone. China had to grow all of it in isolation, from scratch, inside a program nobody else could inspect. You can see that lineage on Tiangong right now. The station carries its own large robotic arm built entirely in China that crawls along the outside and picks up and repositions whole modules. Nobody sold China that arm or the years of know-how behind steering something that heavy with that much precision. It grew all of it in-house, so that isolation is exactly where China's grab and move skill comes from. It grew up end-to-end inside a program the US had walled itself out of with no treaty and no inspection anywhere near it, somewhere no American could watch it develop. And the isolation cuts the other way too. The ISS-S is old, and the plan is to retire it around 2030. If that lands on schedule and no Western replacement is flying yet, the only permanently crewed outpost left in orbit would be the Chinese one, the very program the US spent more than a decade locking out. China isn't shy about that future either. It's already inviting other countries to fly experiments up to Tiangong and offering those moon rocks for the world to study at the exact moment the Wolf Amendment still keeps American scientists on the outside. Even inside Washington, the wall has serious critics now. The defense think tank CSIS flatly calls the Wolf Amendment a bad idea, arguing it did little to actually slow China down, and mostly ended up isolating the United States from a program it can no longer see into. And that's coming from inside the security establishment itself, not from some fringe critic. And once you can grab, the next moves come fast. Watch how the ladder climbs. Jump to 2025. The second Chinese spacecraft, Shenzhou-25, went up specifically to test refueling a satellite in orbit. In the summer, tracking firms watched it approach the same Shenzhou-21 from the tow. By early July, the two craft were so close together that in the optical data they appeared as a single point. They had docked. And Shenzhou-25 pumped an estimated 142 kilograms of hydrazine fuel across to Shijian-21, reported to extend its working life by around 8 years. It's described as the first time anyone has refueled a satellite in that high orbit at all. And here is why that matters more than it sounds. A satellite's working life usually ends when it runs out of fuel. Refuel it in place and it can stay on station for years longer, which is exactly what you want for a spacecraft whose whole job is loitering near other people's hardware. So line them up, rendezvous, grapple, refuel, relocate. Every one of those is ordinary maintenance. Run the same 4 moves on a satellite that isn't yours without asking, and it stops being maintenance. The hardware behaves exactly the same either way. And the frightening version of this was never a satellite blowing another one up. Blowing something up in orbit throws off a cloud of debris that threatens everyone, including the country that fired. The quiet options are the worrying ones. Nudge a satellite a few degrees off its aim, drift up alongside one and eavesdrop, clamp onto it and refuse to let go. Sit next to an adversary's most important satellite and simply wait. You could do all of that without ever blowing anything up. It only takes a spacecraft that can quietly reach out and take hold, which is exactly what China has now shown it can do. And there's one more detail from that refueling test. While China was docking 2 of its own satellites in the highest orbit we use, American surveillance satellites were parked nearby, watching it happen. The US clearly took it seriously, and watching was about the only response it had. By 2025, the language coming out of the US military had sharpened into a single word that made headlines, and then started a fight. In March 2025, General Michael Gwetland of the US Space Force spoke at a defense conference. He was describing something separate from the tow and the refueling. A set of Chinese satellites the US had watched maneuvering in tight, coordinated formation, moving in and out around each other. He called it, quote, dogfighting in space. He described China's orbital forces evolving from what the military calls a kill chain into what he called a kill mesh. A kill chain is the step-by-step sequence from spotting a target to striking it. Turn that into a mesh and the same power gets spread across a web of satellites, so taking out any one of them doesn't break the rest. Now I want to be careful and keep 2 things apart because they get blurred all the time. The tow was Shijin 21. The dogfighting language was about a different, later set of maneuvers, months apart, even though it's the same country in the frame both times. Stacking them into one scary blob is how you lose the people who actually know the file. And the word itself got real pushback, which is what makes this worth taking seriously. Victoria Sampson at the Secure World Foundation pointed out that calling these maneuvers dogfighting frames them as hostile, when the United States does very similar things in orbit and calls it situational awareness. The label quietly assumes an intent nobody has proven. That's a fair hit, and it belongs here. The maneuvering is real and well documented. Whether you call it dogfighting is a word choice, and that word carries an accusation the censors never handed anyone. Which drops us at the real question this whole thing has been building toward. If everyone up there is maneuvering, who gets to check on whom? Because the US isn't a passive victim in this orbit. It runs its own Maneuverable Inspector satellites, a program called GSSAP, spacecraft that drift above and below that high band and slide over to get a close look at whatever they want. 2 of them have literally handed a Chinese target back and forth between each other. Tag team to keep constant eyes on a Chinese craft called Shijian 29. So the honest version isn't China does menacing things and America doesn't. Both sides operate armed, mobile watchers in the same orbit, and here's the uncomfortable ground under all of it. There is no treaty that governs one satellite creeping up on another and grabbing it. The rules we do have were written in the 1960s, before any of this was remotely possible. Nobody has to announce a close approach or ask anyone's permission, and there is no referee up there to call a foul. Every actor in that orbit is basically operating on trust and on whatever the other side's telescopes happen to catch. But there's an asymmetry that matters, and it's where I'll leave you. The American inspectors watch, maneuver, and take a close look. China has already shown it can do the step past watching. Grab a satellite, haul it off, refuel one in place, and it built that entire capability inside a program the US locked itself out of 14 years ago with no shared framework, no joint oversight, no inspection regime, and no phone line to ask what any of it is for. So the law written to keep China's space program contained did the opposite. It pushed that program somewhere no American could ever see it grow, and there it turned into the one skill the US has no treaty and no hotline to govern, quietly reaching out and taking hold of another country's satellites. Right now, one country can do that, alone, 36,000 kilometers up, where everyone else can only watch and guess. The next time one of these satellites drifts towards something that isn't its own, the question won't be what it's capable of. We already know that. The question will be who, if anyone, is allowed to stop it.